Welcome to the future. You're listening to the Consensus Network. Consensus Network. Consensus Network. With Buck Joffrey.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with Consensus Network. Now, I've been off the air for a little while. Part of that's because of the holidays. Part of it is because, well, you know, there's not much exciting stuff going on, and the interest in cryptocurrency and blockchain right now is, I'm sensing, pretty low because I wasn't getting any questions, etc. But it's something I'm still interested in, obviously, and something that we are just kind of in, we're frozen, right? It's sort of like crypto winter. And speaking of winter, I went skiing at Mammoth Lakes over the New Year, and that was kind of fun. Brought my 9, 6, and 3-year-old out there, and the 9 and 6-year-old learned to ski. Very good time. So hopefully you had a good New Year yourself. Now let's go back to crypto. Let's talk a little bit what's going on. The reality is, even though the price is of Bitcoin, for better or for worse, I should say, has not really moved much. We've been sort of right around that mid 3,000 range. The overall market capitalization has not changed significantly. But despite that, infrastructure slowly but surely continues to grow. Projects continue to develop. Despite the frozen nature of the cryptocurrency market. So even though the prices aren't moving dramatically in any sort of direction, the technology and laws around it are. My guest today, she's really just an interesting person in my view, and she right now is at ground zero for all of these developments in cryptocurrency. Her name's Amy Wan. The last time I actually interviewed Amy, which is funny, it was actually for Wealth Formula, which is my other podcast, and it's more of a real estate oriented, not traditional investing, but alternative investing, cash flow investing type show, real assets, etc. Anyway, she was on over a year ago on that, and she was talking about real estate crowdfunding, which was really cutting edge at the time. So she's consistently been at the forefront of technology and sort of the next big thing. And so she's somebody to watch. She kind of knows, she knows what's going on, and she seems to get a sense of where the ball is going. So anyway, right now she's using her laws. Right now she's using her skills as a lawyer to work with all things smart contracts. And so anyway, this conversation that I had with Amy was really interesting. I think you're going to enjoy it, and we will have her on right as we come back from these messages. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest is Amy Wan. She is the founder and CEO of SageWise, which is a dispute resolution infrastructure for smart contracts, which we'll talk about in a bit. She is a securities attorney who has authored the Bloomberg Law Practice Guide to ICOs and LexisNexis Private Equity Practice Guide. She was previously a partner at a boutique securities law firm, which was, I think, the last time I interviewed her for Wealth Formula podcast. And that was, she was involved with the real estate crowdfunding platform. And she's also the co-founder, or she's the founder and co-organizer of Legal Hackers LA. She was named one of 10 women to watch in legal technology by the American Bar Association in 2014, and one of 18 millennials changing legal tech by law.com in 2018. If that's not enough, she was also nominated as a finalist for Corporate Counsel of the Year in 2015 by LA Business Journal. Amy, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So you have been busy. I mean, so we were just talking about this offline. I mean, like the last time we talked, It was on Wealth Formula Podcast, and then it may have been 2016. It might have been
Yeah.
about 2016. I was still back in Chicago, and it was very cold. I've since moved to Santa Barbara here, and you're in LA. Back then, we were talking about securities law as it related to real estate, and I think we were talking about crowdfunding. But and then, so here I am. I'm like, we're friends on Facebook, and I'm like, all of a sudden I see you talking about, EOS and blockchain and cryptocurrency, and I'm like, what happened? So tell me, how did you you find the cryptosphere?
Well, so here's the thing, right? I've actually, been closely following the crypto crowd since I want to say 2012. 2012 was like the first time I ever heard of Bitcoin. Back in 2012, I was working for the federal government. I was out in DC, very frustrated with my government job because it's very bureaucratic and slow moving. And so I was like, I need to find somewhere to channel my energy so I don't drive myself insane while working in government. So
like
I was like,
shutdown or something like that.
Yeah. So I was like, well, I want to learn how to code. And I joined a Coursera course on coding. And one of the assignments was, hey, build a website and ask people for Bitcoin. I was like, what is Bitcoin and why am I online panhandling? Right. So this is like the first time I heard of it.
Wow.
When I moved from DC back to LA in 2013, that was, I was trying to figure out where I wanted my career to go. And that's when I got into real estate crowdfunding, investing, syndication, those sorts of things. But I did briefly take a look at becoming, a Bitcoin or a crypto or blockchain attorney, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But around that time was like when Mt. Gox blew up and all that stuff. And then, over the years, I became known as like a fintech innovation type attorney, a multifamily securities attorney. And what was it? I had left my firm because I found a way to, do all the paperwork stuff for real estate syndication faster. I kind of built like a TurboTax.
Yeah, I remember that because that was part of what we talked about. It was like an automated version that really was cost effective for smaller deals.
Yes. And so we launched that, and, I had cut out probably 20 hours off of every deal that I was doing. Right. And so now it's like much more on autopilot, like it's kind of just set up to run. And people started calling me in early 2017 saying, hey, I want to do this ICO thing. And I was like, what? Okay, what is this ICO thing?
Yeah.
Oh, this sounds like a security. I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole.
Right.
But I was watching the industry closely, and it was like every week I would see some news article that said, hey, this ICO just got hacked for X millions of dollars. And I was like, that's really strange. Like, what's going on here? So I dug in, and, there's this technology called smart contracts that everyone is super excited about. But I looked at it, I was like, oh no, like, this as is never going to work, just based off my experience as an attorney, right?
You mean it wouldn't work, it wouldn't fly in the legal sense?
It's not that it wouldn't fly in the legal sense. It is, everyone says that it's called smart contracts. I always say smart contracts are neither smart nor are they all the time contracts, right? So you have a number of issues. One, you may have coding errors, right? The executive director of the Linux Foundation always says, oh, the last bug dies when the last user dies. So you're going to have coding errors. You may have security vulnerabilities when they're like upgrades to the overarching system. Human nature is, we're a very creative species, and things happen, right? And at the end of the day, what I find is the most important thing in any sort of contract or agreement is intent. It is, what did you intend to get out of this transaction, right? Whereas smart contracts, it's very static, right? And so you cannot amend, modify, terminate a smart contract. And, to the extent there is a dispute around the execution of a smart contract, like in 2016 with the DAO, there's
let me
right
back
today
up a
there's
little
no
bit.
recourse.
Let me back up a little bit. For people who don't necessarily know exactly what a smart contract is, let me give you my dumb version and like the dumbed down version, because I think it's important to have some framework for that. A smart contract, basically, I think of it from a software standpoint, is similar to a vending machine, right? You put money in, there is some sort of program, you push a button, and all of a sudden you get your Twix bar. That's the transaction. That's what I think of as the most simplistic way to describe a smart contract. Do you think, is that fair?
So the example that you just gave is actually the first of two examples that Nick Szabo, the inventor of the smart contract, gave in his initial paper about it. And you're right. I mean, a smart contract is just programmable script. It is if A, then B, right? So if Bitcoin reaches $50,000, then sell half of my portfolio, right? That's the most basic essence of a smart contract. Now, the second example that Nick Szabo gave was that of a car leasing or car rental agreement, right? So instead of, whatever the process is today, you have a smart contract, and so long as you make the monthly payments, then the car works. But the minute that you miss a monthly payment, the smart contract self-executes because it knows payment wasn't made and locks you out of the car, right? Yep. So in theory, that sounds great. You don't have to go try to do crazy collections, hunt down the car, whatever. But there's a number of things that can go wrong. What if it's linked to your credit card, right? And you were issued a new credit card and you didn't update the credit card number. You don't want it to just cut off the contract. You wouldn't want the car to lock someone out if they're in the middle of the desert, right? That creates a safety issue. Sometimes it may not be intentional. Sometimes, human nature, you and I deal with real estate, right?
Right.
What do people do when they know that they're going to get kicked out of something? They don't sit there and they're like, oh, yeah, that's fine. If someone has, lost their job and they know that they're about to get locked out of their vehicle, they are going to pour concrete down the gas nozzle. They're going to Jasco the car and rip the interior leather seats, whatever, right? So the thing is, I think in theory, smart contracts can be a great thing, but in the real world, things become more complicated because we're human, right? And so that's kind of, why we created SageWise. Is we didn't think the world is just as simple as if A, then B, self-executing, immutable, blah, 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 blah. No, you have to meet the true intent of the contract, and you have to provide recourse when intent isn't met.
This is particularly relevant, I would say, probably to a lot of the enterprise type, the business applications of blockchain. Maybe not necessarily just for a transaction of Bitcoin from one person to another, but if you're going to apply blockchain to, as you said, if you want to apply it to all of a sudden, a real estate transaction or, pay rent via a smart contract, things like that. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it really can be applied. Look, right now, there's a lot of hype around smart contracts. People are trying to apply it to everything.
Right.
I don't think you should apply it to everything. I think you need to understand the limitations of smart contracts to really understand when it makes sense and when it doesn't make sense, right? I think it makes a lot of sense whenever you're dealing with numbers or whenever you're dealing with things that tend to be what we call much more dry code as opposed to wet code. So it's more objective as opposed to subjective, right?
Right.
The football team, they either win or they lose, right? It's usually not, something in between. When you get into subjective things if you look at any English contract, they're going to have all these subjective things like reasonable or, substantial. What is reasonable? How do you code for substantial? I don't know. Someone has to make some sort of determination.
So in those cases, the reality is that, and you've been in the space long enough to know, we've talked about this. I actually talked to Nick Carter, who you may or may not know, but Nick Carter was on the show recently talking about, when do you sort of over blockification, like people just trying to blockify everything, right? Like, just in part because, it's sexy and, probably, I think I read somewhere that, there was some publicly traded companies, but just by putting the words blockchain, it resulted in increases in their actual value. So that's part of the issue, right?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with Nick. I think he's right. I think everyone's trying to take this technology and apply it to everything, but you don't necessarily want to do that, right?
Yeah.
Like, just apply it where it makes sense. We don't need
Right.
blockchain everywhere.
Yep.
We just need it where there's issues around authentication or fraud or, things of that sort.
Yeah. And there's some very, very, obviously there's some great uses. So with regard to going back to SageWise then, your company that you have right now, what role do you play? Is it almost like an arbitrator for smart contracts then, or?
So what we are is, I would say, a backstop, right? To the extent that anything is going wrong or looks like it's about to go wrong, we basically have something that's like an arbitration clause in code form that you put into your smart contract when you're drafting it, so that when it's live and maybe about to execute or anything like that, you have basically a panic button that you can push, and it freezes execution of the smart contract. And then the parties can figure out what to do from there, whether they self-resolve the dispute, whether they flip a coin to resolve the dispute, whether they want to amend, modify, terminate, or, actually bring it to, court or an arbitration panel or something. Whatever the parties want to do, that's up to them. We just know that it's not as simple as like, oh, it's self-executing and then it's fine.
So it's basically software that kind of alerts you when you hit that point.
Yes. So it's notification and resolution and enforcement. Right. So that whole piece of it.
It's interesting. It reminds me of other conversations I've had, and we'll get to like EOS, for example, later. But there is this sort of tension in this world right now, because it's relatively new still, particularly, not Bitcoin, but the newer projects and smart contracts, et cetera. There's this tension between what, wanting to, create efficiencies through these smart contracts, and then the realities of humans. So there's almost like, okay, well, what I think that you're going to see, in my opinion, from what you're saying, what others saying, is we're going to see a lot of hybrid uses. It may not be all one thing or the other.
Right.
I mean, I think another example of that is the entire notion of decentralization, right? I think decentralization as a general rule, I think, is a wonderful concept. The problem is that it's not always the best. It's not always completely the best solution, right? So some level of centralization may result in a significantly higher performance, and therefore you're still getting the benefit. At the end of the day, the consumer, the people who are going to use these things, they're going to use them because they make their life better. They make their life easier, and not because they have an ideological reason that it is completely decentralized. You think?
Yeah. I mean, look, so here's the thing, right? And this topic,
You
I feel
agree,
like everyone in cryptoland is like crazy about decentralization.
Yeah.
Oh, we have all these purists and stuff like that. Look, like, to me, decentralization is a spectrum, right? On one hand, you have purely centralized, and on the other, you have purely decentralized. And I actually don't really know what purely decentralized looks like, because it really depends on your perspective, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe the closest you have to it is Bitcoin, because there isn't any sole figurehead, any sole, foundation or anything like that. But at the same time, the Chinese have mined a ton of Bitcoin,
72%.
and most Bitcoin is held by a couple of individuals / companies. So it's still kind of centralized itself, right?
Yeah, I think 72% is the last what I read is in Asia. And I think even within China, it's close. Most of it's in China, and most of it's in one town.
Yeah, so like I think, and just to give a counterexample, like everyone's like, oh, corporations, they're terrible, they're evil, they're super centralized. Okay, well, franchises are, they've been around for decades, and yet they are a type of corporation that is in some ways decentralized, right? And so I don't really believe in purism around this concept. I think it's more so like, okay, well, what works, right? Because in 2017, I had so many people come pitch me all these crazy ideas, and someone was like, oh, a decentralized PR company. I was like, I would never hire that. Like,
right.
I want the PR is all about crafting a story and understanding the client really well, and I just don't see how that would work very well, right? But I do think that there are aspects of different business models and things like that where could it benefit from inching away from centralization? Sure, totally.
Yeah. So that kind of brings me, of course, to when you talk about centralization versus decentralization, then you get to the issue of governance. Tell me what your feelings about governance in these projects. I mean, let's. I want to talk about your involvement with EOS because I'm not entirely sure what you're doing, and I'm dying to know. But let's start with EOS and the governance issues surrounding that, because they're probably the most, the project with the, there's a lot of controversy in the governance.
Yeah.
But it's also a project where I think that it's a good example of saying, maybe a little bit more governance is not necessarily a bad thing. But why don't you talk about that in terms of an example of, governance and centralization and all that?
Yeah, sure. So, in July of last year, I was called up by some folks, and they wanted me to help the EOS blockchain out with certain governance issues. And given that we focus, on dispute resolution, I now chair the EOS Alliance Dispute Resolution and Arbitration Working Group. And so, EOS is one of the few blockchains that purports to be a governed blockchain. And in the original white paper, they envisioned having basically an entire arbitration system. And when the EOS mainnet went live, that's what they had, right? They had this group called ECAF, and they were basically, a highly centralized group of essentially unpaid volunteers who were helping resolve claims that came in, except that, I think through, the fact that they can't dedicate full time to this because they are volunteers, right?
Sure.
So you don't even have paid folks right now. And secondly, perhaps some arbitration orders weren't executed with maybe all the ideal standards of arbitration or dispute resolution in mind, because you want to go for things like transparency, consistency, things of that sort. That ECAF became a very controversial subject. In fact, I think right now that the referendum smart contract went live, there is a suggestion up for vote to basically delete ECAF from the EOS network, right? My personal belief, and we've gathered a lot of, experts in online dispute resolution around this. My belief is that, having a governance structure and a dispute resolution, having the ability to have dispute resolution on their blockchain is a competitive differentiating feature, right? Because without it, EOS is basically a faster version of Ethereum, right?
Which is not a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing,
Right.
but let's say Ethereum does get their act together and achieves, all these technological breakthroughs that they're pining for,
Right.
then where does that leave EOS, right?
Yeah.
So, I think governance is one of those things that can definitely help blockchain become mainstream because if you look at the mission of EOS, it is not like, oh, let's serve the crypto crowd. It's let's serve small businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does small business want? They want transactional confidence. They want certainty. They want to enter into transactions, knowing that they will get what they want out of it and not just like, you know, have no recourse or be held up or whatever, right? So I think it is a very important feature to have. I think maybe the initial way that they designed the arbitration system is perhaps not optimal. There are a lot of concerns about around scalability. You don't want to have a team of volunteers. You really do want to have paid folks. Well, where's that money going to come from? I still don't know today, right? So there's a lot of different
Right.
issues to work through. We got to a certain point within the working group where we came up with a proposal that I think actually works quite well. The only reason I haven't proposed it yet is because there's that genuine question of, well, how are we going to fund all of this, right? Like Block One has a ton of money and then everyone else is just like, it's like crickets, right? And we have no idea whether the work or proposal fund initiative is going to go through. So,
it just for the sake of, again, sort of getting into definitions, we often, you hear these ideas about governance and you hear on-chain versus off-chain governance. Can you talk a little bit about what that means? And when you're talking about ECAF, it's obviously an off-chain governance situation, right?
So here's the thing. I think it's kind of like the whole decentralization debate
Yeah.
where everyone's like fanatical about decentralization. And I think I come from a more moderate approach of, well, decentralization where it makes sense, right? I feel like a lot of people are fanatical about like, oh, everything has to be on chain to prevent fraud. We don't need everything on chain, and you might not want everything on chain.
Right.
So, for example, in real world arbitration, a lot of times this does not become public record. Why? Because small companies, private companies, they don't want to have that information public, right? When you go to court, then the information becomes public. But it's not always a positive thing. There may be personal sensitivities, right? Right now, there's a lot of talk about putting Wall Street, the capital market system and financial services on blockchain. But at the same time, I can't imagine that public companies are going to want to put all their transactions on blockchain because folks will be able to look at the transactions happening. Maybe they will trade stocks accordingly, right? And all this stuff is stuff that normally has to be reported to the SEC. So I don't even know how you would comply with securities laws if all your business data were going on a public blockchain. So privacy and for a lot of legal reasons, I think there's a lot of reasons why you don't want everything on chain, but where having things on chain brings some sort of benefit. Like I never think that this stuff is like black and white, right? I think it's like you have to weigh the pros and the cons and which is more important and what tips the scale as a matter of like public policy.
Yeah, and again, it's one of those things. I think it's an ongoing tension. I heard the Winklevoss twins on a show recently, and they were talking about Gemini, and they had organized some event in New York City, which you may know about, which was basically this big thing where they were plastering. They had a bus, and it said something like Bitcoin or crypto needs rules, and they were like, talk about pitchforks coming at them. And I sort of don't blame crypto purists too, because I think the Winklevoss twins, they may be doing a lot of good for the value of Bitcoin in the long term, but it does seem like they're really on that spectrum of potentially getting a little bit too cozy with Wall Street. What's your feeling on that?
I mean, look, Bitcoin came about because of a general distrust of the financial
Right.
system and the powers that be, right? And I completely understand why, it's a concept that's lauded by, libertarians and anarchists and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. At the same time, I think we also have to take a step back, take a breath, and remember that in order for this stuff to be worth anything, it really needs to be adopted mainstream.
Yep.
If we want this to be the future, it's got to go mainstream. And there's a lot about this whole world that Main Street folks are not going to understand and are not going to be able to manage. Private keys. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Like crypto people can't even manage their private keys. How do you expect, grandma and grandpa to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mom and dad. So, I think that we need, as a community, we need to find ways to make all this easier and more palatable for Main Street folks. And one of many things that has to be worked on is governance, because without it, it's chaos, right?
Right.
And people don't want to work in a chaotic system.
I want to shift a little bit, and there was, obviously there was a number of ETF proposals. A number of them turned down, including one from the Winklevoss twins. There's the one that I think a lot of people seem to be holding their breath on is this one from the Chicago Board of Options Exchange and VanEck Solid X. What's your feeling on? I mean, I would say personally, I was optimistic about this when I saw Bitcoin sitting around, 6,000, 6,500 for like several months, and I'm thinking, there's a futures market already, the CBOE's involved, etc. But with all of the sort of characters that sort of came out of nowhere and created this, weird war with Bitcoin,
Craig Wright.
Craig Wright, and with all that stuff, it's hard to imagine, for me at least personally, that you could see. And I understand that had to do with it didn't have to do with Bitcoin, it had to do with Bitcoin Cash, but I think people underestimate the entire impact of that sort of craziness of individuals who seem to be driving market prices from a bully pulpit. What's your take on the likelihood or not likelihood of an ETF approved, and do you think a lot of these kinds of shenanigans affect it?
I think an ETF is in the realm of possibility one day. Maybe today the regulatory authorities still don't feel comfortable. But right now I'm spending a lot of time talking about and thinking about security tokens or tokenized security offerings, right? So I think as Wall Street starts to take a much more serious look at this technology, and a number of new financial products are coming out, I think that eventually maybe the regulators will get more comfortable and they'll greenlight it. Maybe not today, maybe a couple years from now, but I certainly don't think it's impossible.
Yeah, and but you're certainly not optimistic about this one that I think is. There has to be some decision, I think, by the end of March. You're not that optimistic about that one.
I haven't
That's the
studied that one
CBOE.
closely enough, so I can't say.
Yeah, that's the CBOE VanEck one that everybody seems to be holding their breath on. But at any rate, So what? So the other question I had for you when we were talking about EOS that I don't want to forget is another model that I'm actually kind of a fan of, and I really like the governance model, et cetera, of is what Hedera Hashgraph is doing. Are you familiar with that at all? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, we've definitely had conversations with Hedera.
Yeah. What do you think of their governance model? I mean, to me, what I like about the way they're doing it is they, many of the problems and inefficiencies that we're talking about, Mance Harmon is a smart guy. He was on our show. He was actually on Wealth Formula, and then we put him on this show that we played it on this one as well. But they seem to be anticipating a lot of the issues ahead of time and addressing them ahead of time. And ironically, it seems to be that's what makes them a little bit controversial, right? Is they come off right off the bat and say, "You can't fork us," and they come up right off the bat and they say, "Well, we're going to patent this thing. You can use it, but you're not changing our code." And then people, again, the purists kind of freak out about it. But a lot of the things that you and I are talking about right now are sort of like, okay, well, we're going to make a decision that we're going to go this way because we know it's more efficient. And ultimately, from a user standpoint or a developer standpoint, this is, probably going to make it easier.
I mean, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world because, hey, look, like if you look at the governance debates on all the various public blockchains, it's, it goes around in circles and circles and circles, and sometimes you feel like it's going nowhere, and people aren't dedicated towards that discussion, right? They're just dipping their toe in, so it's hard for them to take the time to really understand the issues, and it can be, it's almost like tragedy of the commons sometimes, right? It's just a lot of talk. It's like crypto Twitter. It's just like an intense time suck, but you never actually get anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
I think, whereas, the beauty about centralized systems is that, okay, at the end of the day, you have responsible parties. Their job, their sole focus is, certain duties, and they have to sit there and make hard decisions and make the executive decisions, and it's on their shoulders, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for better or for worse, they get to make those decisions a lot faster than it would take to have community consensus, right? Consensus, it's a bureaucratic mechanism. It really is.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see. I mean, I look forward to seeing how the Hedera Hashgraph governance structure works, and I will add in that they also envision a dispute resolution system.
Yeah, interesting. Will you be working with them too, or are you?
We actually have a partnership with Hedera Hashgraph. So,
no kidding.
Yeah.
Well, Amy, I have to tell you, I am heavily invested in Hedera, so you better make that work. So, at any rate, listen, where else can we learn about what you're doing? It's just super exciting stuff, and I'm so happy to hear that you're in the middle of this, and of course, it'd be better if we weren't in a middle of crypto winter, but when spring comes, you're going to be right in the middle of it, right? So where can we learn about everything, all the things that you're up to?
Yeah, sure. So I don't use Twitter a lot, but when I do, I'm at Amy Wan, WAN on Twitter. People can find me on LinkedIn. I post a lot there. Facebook, Telegram, the regular social media channels. And then our website is just sagewise.io.
Got it. Amy, thanks again for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
We'll be right back. So welcome back to the show, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed that show. Again, I think Amy is so interesting. I think she's just got, she's sort of like all over the place, but she's like, she's like Wayne Gretzky. Wayne Gretzky always knew where the puck is going, and he was there before everybody else. If you're into hockey, you'll understand what I'm saying. But She's like that kind of person, so it's interesting. Keep an eye out, follow her on Twitter and stuff, and see what she's up to. I certainly will be back in touch with her. She's in LA now, so it'll be good get a chance to meet up with her. Now we don't have any questions, and again, this is part of why I thought we don't necessarily need to be pounding the pavement in terms of content here. We'll do content when it's relevant, when there's things going on, and maybe we'll pick up when the market picks up. But really, what I do want to talk about a little bit is some of the things that are important that we've been looking at. Specifically, we have been waiting for two major things in the institutional side of things. One was the possibility of an ETF. The Chicago Board of Options Exchange and Solid Van Eck had this very promising ETF that a lot of people, literally, even last month, were saying they thought was going to happen. Well, it didn't. And of course, it wasn't rejected. That's the thing. It wasn't actually rejected. Actually, the application itself was withdrawn. Now, why? Well, the official news behind it is that there was, because of the government shutdown, and frankly, that there was no SEC people around to talk to about it and negotiate or whatever, or talk about the issues around custodianship that were the primary concern. And so rather than sort of run out the clock, because I think the absolute deadline is in February, they decided that, hey, we're just going to pull the application off so we don't get rejected because the time ran out. And in the meantime, because the government shutdown, we don't know how long it's going to go. The SEC, people over there are probably driving for Uber right now, trying to make some money while there's all of this ridiculous sort of back and forth in Washington. Anyway, that's that. It doesn't mean it's over, but I will say this. It's not surprising to me. It's a very convenient thing to happen right now too, because I think, as I've said on the show a number of times, I just think the entire ecosystem right now is a little bit damaged from all the nonsense that happened with Craig Wright and the Bitcoin Cash debacle. Anyway, the other thing that we were looking at and we were waiting for was the launch of Bakkt. It was supposed to happen already, right? It was supposed to happen in January, and it got delayed. And they're also saying it's partly because of the government shutdown. You know what? I don't buy it. This all sounds a little bit too convenient to me. I think everyone is really waiting for is bottoming of the market, and market capitulation. And if you think that's already happened, maybe you're right. I don't know. I'm not a trader, but I'll tell you, there's so many people out there right now who think that Bitcoin is going to drop below 2,000 before it heads off to 100,000. That that sheer sentiment by so many people alone is potentially likely to cause it. The technical guys are all over this. We've talked about Tyler Jenks, who was on the show early on. Tyler is still convinced we're going to go to Bitcoin 1,000. And frankly, I hope he's right. I hope he's right for two reasons. First, I would buy a bunch at 1,000. But the other reason is that I don't think that we're going to see, I don't think we're going to see a bull market until we have a true market capitulation. And the fact that this market's just sitting in the mid 3,000s, it just doesn't work that way, right? I mean, you got to have something happen. So it's clear, like even for like 30 minutes where something just goes so low, no one can believe it and everybody's given up. That's what market capitulation is. And I think that's what people are looking for. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but I think that's what people are looking for. So nobody's real eager to go in there right now and buy Bitcoin, even though, if you look at the long-term, possibility of 10xing, 100xing, et cetera, it's considerable. And I think as an asymmetric bet, this is still a very, very good price. But, I just think there's too many people who think it's still not low enough, and that it's still going to have this ultimate capitulation. And I would tell you that again, I'm not a trader, but I've been following Tyler, and I told myself that I really probably am not interested in buying anything until Tyler tells me otherwise. So that's what I'm doing. I think that if Bitcoin drops under 2,000, I'll probably, definitely grab some, because I think, it's hard to predict how close to 1,000 it gets or how much lower. But I think under 2,000, I think would be a no-brainer for me personally. But anyway, check out Consensus Network if you're, again, still, just trying to catch up a little bit about how you can prepare yourself to buy Bitcoin potentially. Grab a Coinbase account. You can get $10 of free Bitcoin if you use my link there, and they'll send me $10 of free Bitcoin too. So we'll be doing each other a favor there. And other than that, make sure you also, if you're interested in learning, I think we've got a link there to Cryptoverse, the Cryptoversity thing that I think is potentially useful for people who really want to learn more. Anyway, that's it for me this week, and potentially next week too. Who knows? On Consensus Network. Thanks for joining me. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.